Welcome to The Last American Vagabond. Joining me today is returning guest and friend of the show, Sam Husseini, independent journalist, regularly attends State Department briefings, which we covered a lot on the show, and founder of votepact.org, here to discuss this primary direction in general, Vote Pact as a new possible option for those that have been rightly frustrated with the political dynamic, and our audience is well aware of my very critical stance of the two-party illusion. So inviting him on today to discuss this possible new direction. Sam, how are you today? Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Ryan. Great to be with you.
Really interesting discussion around this. And I think what's important around this Vote Pact, or really just any different direction, is that I think it's important that people are starting to put forward different possible directions, just critical, like as opposed to the same, which I think your main point around all this is the same old cycle, just the tired nature of falling right back into the same thing every 2 and 4 years. And as you mentioned in a recent interview, sort of the elections themselves being like this effort to just pull people right back into their positions in the party system. So I appreciate what you're trying to accomplish here. So I want to read something that you wrote in 2 different things. It says, most voters don't vote for, often don't even consider voting for third parties because they view voting for a third party as helping the establishment party they most hate. Disenchanted Democrats continue to vote for Democrats because they don't want Republicans. Disenchanted Republicans continue to vote for Republicans because they don't want Democrats. Both are trapped by fear and loathing. This is written in your Vote Pact About Us page, I believe. And then on an article on there, you wrote, the duopoly has jointly ruled for decades. It has gotten worse and worse as a result. The only thing holding it together is how bad one group of voters view the other part. And so I just wanted to start by showing you something that was recently circulating. And this is my point I was opening with. I'm really glad to see a lot of people that usually might not be pointing stuff like this out. I really appreciate it. Here's Aaron Mate. In running against the other party, Democrats fearmonger about being rounded up in fascist prisons, and Republicans fearmonger about being placed in communist gulags. And meanwhile, both parties join hands to cage 2 million Palestinians in an actual death camp. Here's Caitlin Johnstone. Politicians in dystopia land war another candidate will cause dystopia. I just think this is like constant. It's on everyone's minds right now. So it's a really great time for what you're trying to accomplish. So for those that may not know you, feel free to introduce yourself. I argue my audience is very well aware of who you are. I wanted to start with just, what is Vote Pact in general and what drove you to create this?
Vote Pact is a very strategic way for people to break out of the duopoly mind. So instead of people canceling out each other's votes, one voting against Trump, so voting for Harris, and the other doing the exact opposite, that they should pair up and both vote for the third parties of their choice or independent candidates of their choice. This could, at least theoretically, lead to a literal victory of a third party. It was informed, the strategy, by a number of things. There's largely a dissident public. The public wants out of the duopoly, and it keeps voting for people who it thinks are going to break out of it. Like Obama was supposed to be this great agent for change, and Trump was supposed to go in and clean up the swamp. He was supposed to be a typical Republican. But these agents of change end up being farces and delusions, as you've rightly put it. And Vote Pact is a way to break out of that, to siphon votes in pairs from both systems. Now, a lot of your listeners might not be planning on voting for either Trump or Harris. But the other day, Craig Mokhiber, great guy, UN whistleblower, has done great work on Gaza, basically said, I'm going to vote for Jill Stein and don't anybody tell me otherwise. And I was like, I totally sympathize with that, but I think that we need a more aggressive stance. If somebody comes and says, why are you voting third party? Instead of saying it's my vote, saying, why the hell are you voting for a genocidal party? Or an oppressive party, or one that continues to infringe on civil liberties and so on. And their answer will most likely be because the other one is worse. And my answer to that is, yeah, maybe so, but here's your way out of it. Pair up with somebody else on the other side and both vote for your actual preferences rather than being stuck perpetually. I mean, I've gotten a couple of gray hairs here. You're dynamic. has been in place my entire adult life, right? People are in this prison where they are no longer citizens. They are serfs.
Mm-hmm.
Because they have been so inculcated to hate the other half of the duopoly. And meanwhile, the duopoly colludes. They cut their deals. They're after the same agenda on so many things, from war to corporate power to civil liberties, so on down the line. So this is a way for people at the grassroots to come together and effectively upend the establishment. It could theoretically lead to a literal victory for an anti-establishment candidate. That is, if there was a candidate that positioned themselves well enough in what I call the radical center, so that so that both, people who would be Trump voters and would be Harris voters both vote for them. That's a literal path to electoral victory. So that's a brief overview of what the idea is.
Okay. Yeah. Lots of questions we can get into here. And I think one thing you highlighted well on the Vote Pact About Us page and other pages on there is that what we're highlighting here is this is what frustrates people like me so much. And as I'm clearly, you see the same thing, is that every single cycle we keep recognizing, and it's self-evident that you're the lesser of two evils dynamic, where essentially both sides represent a kind of they have more in common about more in common with each other that neither side want. But yet we get driven into sort of choosing which one because you don't want the other. But when you stand back, you have far more in common with the third party or different elements of this conversation. So as always, it shows you that you're being driven to sort of act or vote against your own interests. And this is what's so frustrating about all this is I think it's because, as we can all see, people fall into a position of just desperation because they're convinced that if they do this or that outside of this small spectrum, that they're somehow hurting the outcome, like if there's votes getting stolen or so on. And we will discuss towards the end today my general position about whether I think voting translates, but I wanted to first kind of come at this from the angle of the possibility that this may have an effect. But so I just think it's so frustrating to see how obvious that is. And I think part of this is more so social engineering and I just almost like my brainwashing kind of mindset because of how people will ignore their interest in this regard. But let's go through some of the points I think are interesting here. So one thing I think I agree with in general is I think what we're seeing as a whole, whatever the solution may be, is that the system is weaponized against us. I don't think anybody can disagree with that. Most people seem very disillusioned, as you put it, in regard to all these dynamics, that they're really just two parts of the same larger manipulation, and we get tricked back into it. So, and as I point out all the time, the largest voting block in any election, which is what you're trying to tap into here, are people that simply don't vote. And then within that, it's usually independents are the largest block within it, but they're scattered across multiple parties. So your idea is essentially joining forces with all of them becoming that majority. But I guess my question would be the only way that could be accomplished and really change anything is if we get enough people to get involved with this, right? So, and that would become that majority and choosing that path. So is that first correct that you would have to get enough people for this to become effective, or is there a part where that has an effect before the majority is suddenly on this side? That's the first question.
Yeah. My assessment as to how this would play out if it caught on is I think the first pairings are the hardest.
Mm-hmm.
When I was watching your intro with the sparks flying, I used to go to Sunday school when I was a kid, and one of the songs we'd always sing, it only takes a spark to get a fire going, and then
Right.
I'll let it around warm up and it's glowing, I think. So that those first sparks are the hardest, but once they come to fruition, then it becomes more than just an idea. I hate that phrase, just an idea, because there are a few things more powerful than ideas.
Right.
It becomes a tangible thing. And if you have a series of people who can talk about how they came to make an agreement that they were intending to vote for Harris, but they caught on to this idea and decided to reach out to a friend or a debating partner or relative, whatever, who was planning on voting for Trump, and both decided to vote for other candidates. And they don't even need to decide right away which other candidates. and they tell that story, then that becomes an impetus for other people to do so.
Right. Like
And
an
then
Milgram experiment kind of point where more people will realize it's possible.
correct.
Mm-hmm.
And then as that spreads, then more and more people can do that. Then I kind of hate celebrity culture, but then then you see celebrities doing it. Then it becomes difficult for the media to ignore.
Mm-hmm.
Then ultimately, I think once you get to a point of shattering the illusion of inevitability of one or the other of the two main parties, the establishment parties winning, then all bets are off, right?
Mm-hmm.
Everything could take on a life of its own at that point if people don't view it as inevitable that
Right.
either one of those candidates will actually win. That would be the extreme scenario of the opening up the possibility of a literal win. Short of that, I think Vote Pact has its own power, even even if it's not employed, and that is that it gives people somewhere to go.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I mean, the entire stance of Kamala Harris, you want Trump to win, when she was, when pro-Palestinian protesters were chanting at her, and this has been a mantra by the Democratic establishment. You must be a retard. Rahm Emanuel once said, that you're speaking up against the Democratic candidate because that'll help the Republican. This gives some people someplace strategic to go that doesn't help the candidate that they like the least.
Mm-hmm.
It's a strategic move. It gives people leverage. Mm-hmm.
So just to understand that. So, but the argument being that if they, and let's dive further deeper into this exact, so people further understand how this actually works. But so you're saying that if the idea being that if they normally would have voted for the other side, or rather just within the two-party paradigm, for fear that they voting third would then help the other side. How is it different if they're voting for third? How does that not still hypothetically help the other side? Like the point you're making there.
Yeah, because it's being done in pairs.
Okay. So go ahead.
Yeah. So we're siphoning off votes in twos, one Democrat, one Republican, and taking them both, and that they're both voting for the third parties of their choice. So it doesn't change the balance between the Democrats and Republicans, but it diminishes both of them.
I like it. Yeah, it's a very simple concept. I mean, it's very interesting. But so this is my point, though, that obviously, other than the awareness that something else is going on, that there's a viable possibility, or even just the momentum, it would need to effectively have a majority for this to start being seen as a difference, right? But I think that's my point. Is go ahead.
I don't think it needs a majority to start making a difference. I think if it just simply starts registering, and if people start telling their stories, it will be seen as a threat, and it will impede the duopoly continuing to scam their voters, right? Because they will see that more and more voters are waking up to the possibility that they can actually vote their interests in this way. Because I mean, like you indicated, a lot of people have checked out,
right?
They've said this is a scam. Voting is a scam. So we're not going to do it. And I sympathize with that, but I believe in using every tool we got. And
right. That's an excellent point right there, is that I think that's my biggest thing, is that you're tapping into the largest voting block is people that don't partake. And so reaching them could easily change that. And to be clear, I'm not saying that, obviously, I mean, I think this is a great idea. The difference is clear in a lot of ways, but I meant like in the sense of like seeing, as you pointed out, like an actual possible win. And I think that was the direct route right there. So yeah, I mean, I think this is basic and makes sense as long as you can get people to get past that block of thinking that by doing this, they're challenging something else. And that's the one for one concept, as you list here as well, though. So they can vote for us. It doesn't even have to be the same third party candidate, correct? Can you explain that for me as well?
Yeah, it doesn't. it would be most effective if it were the same third party candidate, because it would more clearly then open up the possibility of that candidate winning. I mean, I think Ralph Nader could have done this in 2000. He sort of had appeal to both the left and right. I kind of used to envision a Ron Paul, Dennis Kucinich ticket as having that possible appeal. You can think of some people on the political stage now that might be able to to formulate that combo. But even short of that, if, for example, you had tons of Democrats, would be Harris voters, shifting to Stein or some other third party candidate, Greens, whatever, and Republicans going to Libertarian or Constitution Party, then those voters would not be treated as serfs anymore. Right. The parties can't continue to say, you got to vote for me unless you want this other person who's worse. People can say, no, I can do this other thing. I can pair up with my drinking buddy or my relative who I argue with all the time. And instead of just arguing endlessly, you can actually cooperate. I mean, even somebody you disagree with, it's very interesting what you said about social engineering, that we have been socially engineered by the establishment. And my response to this is to effectively create a new social relationship.
Right.
What some people have called the vote buddy. So you have somebody on the other side who you disagree with. I'm not saying, get married or it could be a spouse, actually. I'm not saying that you suddenly, are in utopia and everybody agrees with everybody. No, you can still adamantly disagree with them about things, but you are both fed up of being used as a tool by the establishment. And that you both want a way out of the establishment, although your solutions might differ, or your language might differ as to where you want to go. But in terms of policy, I see a lot of agreements between the conscientious conservative and principled progressives.
More so than the disagreements between the two parties, like I was saying before. Like there's more. You made that point well better than I did in your writings. That there's clearly more alignment with the parties that are voting against each other, as opposed to the collective disagreements of the two parties that actively act against what most people want, like wars or anything else. And I since I broke in, I think it's important. I like the point you're making there is an amicable disagreement. This is such an important thing for people in the political sphere, and nobody seems capable of that today by and large. And so that's one benefit to this, on top of everything else you're pointing out, is to drive people to be able to have a disagreement, yet similarly see a path they want going forward. I love that. I think that's a great benefit to all this.
Absolutely. Yeah. People have said, well, this is kind of like do-it-yourself ranked choice voting or score voting, voting reforms that people have advocated. And I largely agree. But the system isn't going to, give you the tools of its own demise.
Right.
So it is do it yourself.
Can you elaborate on that for me? The vote. I was going to ask you about this in general, ranked choice voting or score voting. Can you elaborate on what that is and how this might be similar? It's something that was new to me when I was reading your website.
Well, ranked choice voting is a voting system whereby people can, say, 1, 2, 3, 4, rank the candidates that they want. And then, it's sort of like runoff voting, where, if nobody gets a majority of first choices, then, it starts taking into account second choices, and it simulates a runoff election. So, you could say, I want, whatever, Green Party is my first choice, Libertarian Party is my second choice, Democrat is my third choice, Republican is my fourth choice, for example. And then, it would tally that up. This does it, and score voting is similar, except you're like rating them, whether, they're, 100 or 90 or whatever, and it tabulates differently. There are different types of possible voting reforms, and there have been books written about the pluses and minuses of each of them. This sort of simulates that, but it simulates that, and it has two advantages, main advantages. You can do it yourself. You don't need the government's permission to do it. And the second advantage is that it fosters dialogue, as you indicate, so that you don't end up not talking to the person or burning the relationship or just avoiding politics. You end up, oh wow, okay, I can cooperate with this person, and it fosters a more mature political attitude. I can disagree with somebody, but figure out how I can work with them.
Which is supposed to be the basis for our political system, but clearly that's not how this works, right? I think that's so far that's probably the most important thing in how this immediately can have a positive effect, I think. And so, and right now, as I'm sure you're aware, and you've talked about, is that with what's going on around Gaza and Israel and this kind of evolving awareness, there's this opportunity I can't stop seeing where people are more aligned in specific ways than I've ever seen before. And so this is a perfect moment to take advantage of that, as it were, to sort of, that there's the alignment of I think the majority of people in general that can recognize this is simply not okay. And yet both parties are all in line with it. So that's a perfect moment to sort of go, look, we are on the same page, at least when it comes to very moral, things that we all seem to care about in the world. So that's an obvious positive step there. But so one thing I think is so let's take this into the step of like actual succeeding in the sense of like getting elected. So I think it's obvious to see the benefits thus far of at least showing people that there's another choice, that we can work together around all of this, and that bottom line, we're being manipulated by these two parties. But so let's just say hypothetically this becomes possible in the sense of actually being elected. But I think the problem here is that here's the article you wrote, actually. This one is called "If the Greens and Libertarians Joined Forces, They Could Win." But so my question would be, what about the differences of the parties and the policies? Like, how do you work beyond that, knowing the current state of like the polarization of our political system right now? Do you see that being, I mean, obviously you do. Can you explain why you think that's possible, that they could sort of overlook those differences to achieve the win in the meantime?
I think some of the differences are more superficial than we think they are. For example, take immigration. That's a big polarizing issue between quote unquote left and quote unquote right. But it's a symptomatic issue. It's caused by trade deals, drug policies, military and other interventions in other countries. That's what causes desperate immigration. And there, I think, in large part, principled progressives and conscientious conservatives agree. They're against the drug policies that are driving this. They're against the corporate trade deals that are impoverishing people in various countries so that they come to the United States in economic desperation. They're against the wars that cause desperate migration. And so I think a lot of the issues that the establishment delights in having people at the grassroots feud about are actually issues that if people on the grassroots left and right got their way on other things, stop the wars, stop the drug war, stop the corporate trade deals, then you wouldn't have the problem that so consumes so much of the establishment narrative in terms of left and right being at each other's throats. That's one example. I think that dynamic exists throughout. I would even extend this to sort of the fulcrum issue of abortion. I've done a fair amount of work on pandemic origins the last several years, and I think long term, the establishment agenda is for genetic engineering of human beings and transhumanism. And I think you've done some work on this. I know Whitney Webb's done some work on this, that's the long term threat. And that to me is a threat to both people who regard themselves as pro-life and people who regard themselves as pro-choice. You're not going to have a choice. You're not going to they're going to redefine life. Right. They're going to take away choice in the long term. That's the establishment agendas. They want you to keep fighting over abortion so that they can, over time, and I'm not talking about next Tuesday, I'm talking about in the coming decades, bring in a regime that redefines what life is, that redefines what choice is, redefine what human means.
Right.
I think that is part of what I view as the imperative to have this sort of left-right alliance.
I agree completely. And something I often talk about, and just the basic, further back reality is that it's all, whether it's abortion or anything else, it's always the divide issue. So we're ending up pointing at the other side of the aisle or just at your neighbor instead of recognizing that it's just another multiple parts of the same government that are putting you in this position. And I know it's difficult for people to see it that way who have invested their identity in these different party sides, but it's really just all our government at the end of the day. And so I really value the way that, this is, this has a lot of possibility to, if anything, hopefully have somebody win, but really just start pulling people out of the paradigm. And I think that's the first step in any discussion we're having. But so I agree with you. And I love the point you made there that really it's more so manipulation or superficial at the end of the day. But so that comes to the idea that we're talking about these parties, which I would argue that there's very clear examples of any of these parties, Libertarian especially, Green Party especially, that there's been parts of it that I would say have been co-opted, or that there are people involved with these parties that just don't have good intentions. So how do you get past something like that?
Yeah, no, I don't disagree with that. I'm not trying to idealize the parties that exist now.
And to be clear, any parties we're discussing, I'm just using Libertarian and Green as examples.
Yeah. I agree. And, assuming that Vote Pact doesn't take off in this election cycle, I am hoping that my work on this will lead to a political formulation that would be more highly principled and wouldn't be co-opted. I see, and I don't know if this is opportunism or not, Jill Stein, has sort of broken with some of the Green Party establishment in that she, I've heard her, they had a debate a while back, where she talked about the Federal Reserve, which is usually, a quote unquote right-wing issue. She talked about COVID lab origins, not as directly or articulately as I would like, but it was good to see that. So whether that's, a genuine awakening in the Green Party or just simply opportunism on her part because she knows which way the political winds are blowing, I think indicates that there is, a possible manifestation of, as I say, an anti-establishment radical center that takes a principled stand on things like civil liberties and online censorship, right? I mean, you had people who were, all upset about online censorship when it came to the pandemic, and they're for it when it comes to Gaza.
Right.
Like, the people that I respect were against it in both instances.
Right. Exactly.
And I think that's part of the Machiavellian nature of the establishment, that it divides people in these things so that they end up betraying their own principles, so that people who seem to be taking a principled stand during the pandemic have abandoned it for political expedience. So they become hollow, and they become co-opted as a result of that.
Right. Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think things like this are what will weed out these pretenders, I would put it, that there are clearly people on both sides of the paradigm who are just saying what they want to hear. And as you point out about Jill Stein and so on, I love what she's been saying lately, but I'm just jaded in regard to the system in general that it's hard for me. I'll always err on the side of she's probably just doing it because it's, like you said, the way the winds are blowing, but I'll still lean into it, right? I still think it's a positive thing to see them making these statements. I mean, that's kind of to your point before about the celebrities. I think that's one of the easiest ways to see a positive benefit here is that if you get enough momentum, there will be politicians. I'm actually surprised to see someone at the level of Jill Stein doing that. And maybe that just means it's genuine, but usually it's the ones that are like just underneath them. They're a little bit prominent, but they're not the leading one. And they see an opportunity, right, to step in with the momentum. And that's what this could accomplish. You get a lot of other people that start leaning into this, whether they really mean it or not. It's still positive momentum that can be taken advantage of. So, and all these points I'm making are really, just I think the obvious things that people might worry about. Not to say necessarily these are any reason that we shouldn't be leaning into this, but the next one I would ask would be in regard to, so they win, who would essentially be in charge in your mindset? And these may be too far out to kind of, we'll get there when we get there kind of a thing. Right. But like, so how would it work if you've got parties working together? How would that work out after the fact? Do they have to make a new party? Like, how do you kind of envision that?
Yeah. you know, like I say, I think a lot of the issues that they disagree on, they can address what I perceive as the root causes of the problems. I mean, no matter what your stance is on issues, you pick your priorities, right? I mean, like Ron Paul, I guess technically is, you know, against Social Security. But if by some miracle he became president, I don't think the first thing he would do is to ditch Social Security. I think the first thing he would do is end the wars, bring the troops home, go after
Right.
the Federal Reserve. Da, 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 da. He'll have his hands full doing things that I think, you know, a huge part of the, you know, enlightened left would agree with before he got to do things that he might want at some level, but that would be deal breakers in the quote unquote left. But it would, you know, I mean, there would be issues. I mean, for example, I mean, I'm still for, you know, Medicare for all, you know, enhanced Medicare for all, as somebody who came out of the left. But I do see, you know, a threat about it regarding medical privacy. So, could we come to a better solution for that does give everybody decent medical coverage, but that takes into account concerns that, say, libertarians or others would have. And I don't know, maybe libertarians just on principle don't want everybody to have, free, no cost access to medical care. Yeah. So, I mean, there could well be disagreements. There could be compromises, or like, okay, we'll do Medicare for all and we'll go after the Fed, so, we both get our number one, our leading priorities of what we want, let's do all the things that we agree on, which is, I think a substantial amount.
I agree.
That will get rid of some of the things that we disagree on because they'll become tangential or very much more minor issues than they currently seem. And let's do some compromises, not to, poke each other's eyes out, but to say, this is really important to me. This is really important to me. Let's both get it done. And this is honestly the way that the establishment works now, right? They're cutting their deals all the time to the detriment of the American public. They got the public hating on each other, so they get to cut their deals behind closed doors. I'm saying let's have an open process where the public actually benefits.
I agree. And, it's really refreshing. What's funny about it is all these questions are basically rooted in the same point. That is, this is clearly leaning into the belief that we can be a bigger person, put our issues aside and work together for a better future in any sense. And I think what the problem is the system currently would love to just frame that as naive. I disagree. I think this is how we can and should be. And I think the problem is that, like, a great point that I always reference, Caitlin Johnstone has made this in the past, that the establishment, whatever you want to call it, it clearly projects what it thinks we want. It's clearly not what it pretends to be, but clearly it at least thinks that we want people that talk about spreading freedom and democracy and working for human rights, and clearly, right? So I think the point is that we generally want those things. And I think that the illusion that somehow working and compromise in a positive way is like that's somehow naive. That's the illusion. So I really agree that ultimately this is what will be possible if we lean into our better nature. And I think that's what a lot of the two-party system right now is working to drive us away from, like the lowest common denominator. I don't know about you, but I can't stop seeing that everywhere. Worse than I've ever seen before, like leaning into the worst of human nature from both sides. And so I think this is a great direction. I really do. And I think that issues aside, which there will always be in politics, I think there's a lot of possibility here. You have a comment? I was going to jump into the next question. I thought you were going to say something, but I'll jump into the next one.
Sure.
Okay, sorry. I thought I heard you say something. I didn't want to cut you off. So I was looking at my notes here. So the next question I wanted to ask you was that, we ultimately, I guess, first one would be that, this would clearly have to go through, unless we somehow succeed in multiple election cycles. So I guess just pointing out, I see that as another, roadblock, but ultimately this would be a building process. And I guess the question I was going to ask you would be about the Electoral College, right? So let's just say that this gets mass adoption. Today, this election, right away, all of a sudden, this is just all over the conversation. Do you foresee any potential issues with the Electoral College in multiple different ways? Do you think that might end up being some kind of a tool against what you're accomplishing? How do you see that?
I'd have to look more closely in terms of how it is per state, depending on if you need a majority or a plurality
Hmm.
to win all of the electors. I know things like, states like Maine do it proportionately, but most states it's a winner take all. And I believe it's based on a plurality. Lincoln won in 1960 in a four-way race. It was a very chaotic election. I'm quite sure he didn't win a majority of the American public, but he won a majority of the electors. So that might, actually increase the possibility of this taking off, in that you don't necessarily need a majority of the American public, because there are probably a lot of people who are just glummed onto the idea that they got to vote for the Democrat and they got to vote for
Hmm.
the Republican because they're glued to MSNBC or Fox or whatever. Um, so yeah, I that's not something I've fully thought through, but I think that's my impression, that it is, or not something that I fully researched in terms of the Electoral College and how that would play out.
Well, you make a good point. I mean, it definitely could end up in the positive, but I mean, I guess there's multiple ways you could get into that. I have a kind of a mixed thought process, or mixed opinion on where the conversation about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing and how it can be abused. But I guess ultimately my worry is like the obvious abuse of that. We've seen, like, for example, in a similar conversation, like with the primaries or like the DNC, and ultimately just skipping these things, or like lying to people about the process, or like Debbie Wasserman Schultz admitting essentially that they can just pick who they want. The same thing with the Electoral College we saw in the last few elections, where it turns out you hear from some of these people where they ultimately admit, well, I'm supposed to vote for what the direction, but they make arguments somehow that they have a moral obligation to vote for something else. See, I just worry that might be a sticking point for, let's just say you get the momentum, there might be a way that they could use this to manipulate, they being just political elitists, But you make a good point. You could go either way. But my worry is that, I guess, obviously, my opinion is clear to my listeners out there. I think this whole system is so wildly manipulated, multiple levers at multiple aspects of this entire process, to the point where, well, we can end with that, about whether I think your vote even translates. And I worry about how many ways that might be able to stop something like this, because clearly this represents a massive threat to what they're trying to accomplish, right? So if you have any other thoughts on what other things might be applied to stop this, should it start having momentum?
I mean, a lot of people have told me that they think that the whole voting system is completely rigged in terms of the voting machines, and
Mhm.
therefore this is, uh, a non-starter or severely impeded for that reason. I would somewhat, answer to that to say, you know, if this starts to take off, then it'll become evident. Um, you know, Lawn signs, polling results, attendance at rallies for independent or third parties. And it could well be a step towards exposing the
Mhm.
other mechanisms of, uh, control and manipulation, like the voting machines, uh, other such things. So I think that it's a strategic way to, at minimum, to disrupt the establishment's control over the system. And
Mhm.
it scales up in that it isn't simply disruptive, it's actually building up bonds that are actually beneficial, and could literally lead to an actual victory for anti-establishment forces.
Yeah, so that's exactly where I was going to go with this, is that, so my audience is well aware that I just flat out do not believe, and I think there's enough evidence to clearly point in this direction, that our vote translates to the outcome. Now, I can get into a debate about whether it's literally just non-existent, or that there is enough manipulation in place to where it just, at the end of the day, doesn't really translate to what we're actually voting for, and but somehow has some level of difference involved. I simply think there's so many examples going back that show us this, and I don't have to go into all of it. One side says Russia stole it, the other side says they cheated. Everyone's in some way pointing at our system doesn't work properly. And so my that's what I was going to ask, which you essentially just went into there, is that if that's the reality and our vote doesn't have any effect, what would be the point of all this? And I think you answered it. And I think what you've already outlined today, which is what I've come to, just in this interview so far, really appreciate, is that whether or not let's just, what voting has an outcome, changes the outcome or not. And the idea being to try to seek somebody getting elected. You've already outlined like 3 or 4 things that just the beginning of this process, the working with somebody on the other side of a political spectrum, have very positive effects. And right there to the end point, that if you got enough momentum with this, it would expose the fact that the voting system isn't even present. So, I mean, I see a lot of different reasons for why this is obviously a positive system or a positive choice for people to make, whether or not you think that the voting even translates. So that's unique for me, you understand, because I'm very resistant to a lot of things in this field or this kind of conversation because of that very point. But I can easily support something like this because it will end up having that positive effect. And then still, I'm always the person that will say, I hope I'm wrong, that I hope that your voting has a difference and we can change the system. And so I see nothing but positive here, man. So I really love what you're doing here.
Thank you. If I could make a sort of point adjacent to that, and that is like how I view much of the trajectory of U.S. history. At its beginnings, it restricted the vote, the franchise, to white male property owners, and then it gradually was forced to expand it because it pretended to be about democracy and da 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 da. So you give it to non-property owners who are white. You give it to black men. You give it to women. You actually, get rid of impediments in voting and so on. So they've expanded the franchise, but in the process, they've hollowed it out. And that's why people don't vote and why people don't care, because they realize that it's all being done by, deals in back rooms and, and manipulation, and the two parties collude. And, so they've attempted to make the vote worthless. And I think this is a maneuver that says, we can get around the way you've manipulated it by siphoning off votes against the duopoly in this way. So this is kind of a response to this historic trend of how they have attempted to, make the vote, a purely perfunctory thing.
Absolutely. I mean, I think this is obviously a positive step in all this. And I think anybody out there, whether or not you think that your voting translates, or especially if you're, again, I've never wanted to dissuade anybody from voting if they think that's going to have an effect, and so if you're planning on doing so, I think this is the smartest direction to go in. I guess the last thing I was going to ask in general is, have you thought about having any kind of a service essentially to try to connect these people? Because I think that's the biggest block, is that as everyone's being bombarded with, propaganda meant to keep them from crossing those lines or speaking to their neighbor. So, one, just how do you feel like you can deal with that? And then have you thought about having something that like connects people in that way?
Yeah. A bit of history to this. I came up with this idea, but it was sort of adopted by a group backing Gary Johnson in 2016. And they set up software to connect people. And somebody recently volunteered, and he's looking at doing that.
Nice.
For me, I wouldn't mind if there are multiple platforms of things connecting people, so long as it can get complicated in that there's the factor of trust. So that's one question about it, and there's the factor of you don't want people saying, I'm going to trade my one vote and I'm going to make the deal with 3 different people.
Okay. Yeah.
So there's multiple levels of trust that it's a one-to-one pairing, unless people are open about it and say, I really want Harris, and 2 people are like on the fence about Trump, and they decide to do a 2-for-1 trade, if that's what all parties are aware of and want. So, doing it online or anything like that potentially opens up some issues, but I think that they're addressable, and I'm totally open, as I am with this one volunteer who's come forward, and potentially others, in terms of setting up such platforms.
Yeah. I mean, I would personally argue that it makes the most sense, especially before this becomes something with more momentum, to work with people that you can deal with personally. It's like you said, your spouse or your people in your family or your neighbors, or that way you can be sure that you guys are on the same page, as opposed to, like, I worry with the online aspect or mail-in or whatever else, that's an easy way for nefarious characters to manipulate this. And I can obviously see that this would be a threat. So that's what I would argue personally. But I love that this is happening in general, man. And I really, like, I think anything that's leaning away from the common, just the same old cycle, I'm all for at this point. And I really see how this could help even somebody from my perspective in regard to voting, whether it has an effect, and being able to expose these things, and really more than anything, bringing people together, especially across political lines. There's nothing but positive about that. So I really, really think this is a great thing, man. So anything else you want to leave us with in regard to what people where they can go? And I'll bring up your links and everything, or, what they should be thinking about coming into the election. Anything else you want to leave us with before we end today?
Sure. No, just votepact.org. There's stuff there. If people want to help out, I'd love it if people created, animated or, memes or images to explain the idea, in an instant. I'm not a designer. I don't do videos. That would be incredibly valuable. Probably the most valuable thing is real life stories.
Right.
People, coming together. And like I say, if people are already set on saying, I'm not going to vote for either Harris or Trump, or you're out of your mind, well, you're in a very powerful position to be a matchmaker, to bring people together. And I think that, one impediment is that people probably, might think, oh, I don't know anybody on the other side. No, you probably do. You just probably avoid talking politics with them.
Right.
And this is an opportunity to do that.
Well said, man. Yeah, I really value this, and I'm glad to see this happening. And I think this, if doesn't take effect or really catch fire, let's say, in this next election, I think this is something that will begin to have momentum as soon as people recognize that there needs to be something else. I mean, I think this election, more than anything, is going to be one of those moments that hopefully kind of shake more people free from this. So thank you for what you're doing, Sam. And I look forward to seeing more of your questions that they ignore in the State Department.
You're not calling on me, man, but we'll see.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Well, thanks for being here, Sam. And as always, everybody out there, question everything. Come to your own conclusions. Stay vigilant.
Thank you, Ryan.